So if you've ever wondered what the best summon is in Elden Ring, and you tried looking it up, you might have come up with an item that was called the Mimic Tear Ashes. What it does is it summons yourself for 660 HP, and people will tell you this is the best summon. Well, I'm going to tell you today that it is definitely not the best summon, depending on what you are doing. I actually found a summon that I think is maybe not the best, but it's one of the best, and it's definitely better than the Mimic Tear. And how is that possible? Well, it comes down to practicality. So the Mimic Tear, it, summons yourself. So it summons you with your exact armor, your exact weapons, your exact spells, and you can load it out and try to optimize it for every boss that you fight, which you may already be doing. But some bosses it's good for, and some bosses it's just not very good for, no matter how you gear it up. And some people have arguments of, oh, you can heal with it, you can whatever. But there's something else that's much more simple and tends to get much more value in actual practical circumstances. This one may shock you, but the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes are actually totally busted. And the reason being, in an actual practical scenario, you will get way more value out of the Great Shield Soldier Ashes. You'll get way more value out of that than you'll ever get from the Mimic Tear, depending on the boss and how it fights. And the reason this is because in a real fight, you're going to back your summon up. You're going to be following up with damage. You're going to be doing something to try to kill the boss that your summon is fighting. You don't just summon your summon and then just let it fight till it's dead. You always try to back it up in a real fight so that you can get as much damage as possible before your summon dies. If you are playing like that, that changes everything. Because a lot of tests people do on these videos, they'll literally summon a summon and then watch it fight to the death and then go, look how good it did, therefore it's the best. But the thing that's totally busted about these guys that makes them so good in a real world practical scenario is that the Great Shield Soldiers, there's 5 of them and they all have a Great Shield. I'm going to put one of these on, okay? And most of the time they just stand there holding their Great Shield. They sit there and they just block and they block and they block. But that's not what really makes them OP. What makes them OP is that they are way better at holding aggro. At test after test after test that I did, no matter what, the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes, because there's 5 of them, somehow that just draws aggro. It draws aggro so much better than the Mimic Tear. Whenever I did the Mimic Tear, I constantly had the boss on me. He just constantly swaps to me and goes for me like every other attack, or maybe in the majority of attacks. But when I summon the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes, not only are they equal to the Mimic Tear in survivability, they tend to hold the boss's aggro about 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 5 of his attacks, which allows me to just sit there and just combo him over and over and over again with something like the Sword of Night and Flame, or whatever abilities that you guys want to hit, depending on the bosses. Do you want to fight him with range? Do you want to follow him with melee, hit him in the back, however. If you want to know how to get the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes, I have a link in the description of this video that'll show you where to get them. But just a quick summary, it's going to be in the underground area of Nokron Eternal City Grace, and you'll run down a ramp and you'll go to your front right, and it's in a corner on a dead body. But I'll have a video specifically on that. It's like a 1-minute video or something if you want to go check that out and get the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes. I tried a few tests. First off, I had +2 of the Mimic's Tear and the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes, and I tried it against a somewhat late game boss, a pretty late game boss, honestly. And this boss was one that's actually really good at killing the Great Shields, because he has crazy AoE, he whips around, he flies around, he jumps around, he does all sorts of crazy stuff, which is actually a spot that the Great Shields are not that good at. But even then, they were pretty much equal to the Mimic's Tear almost every single test that I did, if not better, when I was actually following up with them. When I'm trying to actually take the boss down while the summon distracts it, the Great Shield always performed equal to or greater than the Mimic Tear in every single test that I did. That's excluding the fact that the Mimic Tear was absolutely terrible at holding aggro. It made it much harder for me to get my job done without getting killed on accident. And needless to say, how you build your Mimic Tear is going to change everything. In my case, I built it with the heaviest armor that I had and a shield, just trying to get it to sit there and absorb damage. I gave it the Sword of Night and Flame so it would occasionally deal some damage, which turned out to be a pretty significant amount of damage, but with the boss on it, it's almost never going to get that damage off if the boss is a faster attacking boss. But if I built the Mimic Tear without being tanky, if I just threw on just some random chest piece and nothing else, or just some light armor, then it was night and day. The Great Shield Soldier's Ashes was so much better than Mimic Tear for holding aggro and tanking the boss that it was just pathetic. It wasn't even worth using Mimic Tear at all. So if you're trying to build your Mimic Tear as like a spellcaster, something to do damage with you or something like that, the Great Shield is going to last way longer than that and give you way more time to get value. And there are arguments to be made for the Mimic Tear of building it certain ways, giving it great heal or doing different tricks to get more value out of it, to get more time out of it. And it really just depends on the boss, because some bosses are so aggressive, they're almost never going to let the Mimic Tear heal. When it goes on to you, maybe it will heal sometimes and then it'll last longer. So there are some tricks that you can do like that. But the bottom line is, it sucks really bad at holding aggro, which is what you really need. And it doesn't last very long if the boss actually stays clung to it and combos the hell out of it. With the Great Shield guys, they get spread out, so even if the boss does some super combo on them, he tends to only catch 1 or 2 with them, and there's still 3 left. And so on top of them being tanky and blocking tons of damage, that also factored in to make them last even longer. What's more, depending on how the boss environment is and how it starts the fight, if you're in a situation where you have time actually to summon, you can easily follow up your Great Shield soldiers with some kind of buffs, some kind of heals. You can give them the greater Erdtree whatever buff that gives them healing over time, which is probably one of the best ones for the skeletons. And then you can also give it a buff that will give it attack and defense, which is also really good. So if you have time to prep with them, you can make them even more powerful and last even longer and get so much value out of them. It's actually crazy. But it doesn't end there, okay? So I thought, well, maybe it scales differently. Let's check something out. So I went and got some Glove Wart and all that stuff. I leveled up the Mimic Tear to level 9, and I leveled up the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes to level 9. Took them from level 2 to level 9, went back to the same boss to see what the differences would be. How would the scaling come out? And then doing the exact same experiment, I had pretty much similar results. Now when fighting this boss, the Great Shield Skeleton guys could actually just absorb an obscene amount of damage and stay alive really long and keep aggro really well. From when I hit +9, it really seemed like in my experiments, the Great Shield performed even better than the Mimic Tear compared to the last test. They were still just way better. It really made it feel like they were just way better because they were strong enough to stay alive, but because there's 5 of them and they're all over the place, they held aggro so unbelievably good compared to the Mimic Tear that I was basically free to do anything I want. I just sat there on the sidelines just spamming Sword of Night and Flame until the boss occasionally aggroed. I'd run away, heal, and dodge, and he'd just quickly be aggroed back on the shield guys, and then I could just sit there and just shoot at him. I actually had to stop shooting at him and, just wait for my skeletons to die because they had done such a good job tanking and such a good job keeping his aggro that I actually just won the boss fight no problem, and if I would have kept doing it, I would have just won with like 3 skeletons left or something like that. The Mimic Tear, on the other hand, over and over and over again in the tests, underperformed really hard at the +9 scenario, because while now the Mimic Tear could absorb an obscene amount of damage with my heavy armor on and a shield that has 100% physical absorption and all this stuff, the problem was he just sucked so bad at holding aggro that I constantly found myself being pressured, and then I would go and I'd maybe get 1 laser beam on him, and then he'd be back on me, and I'd be running around unable to fight back. And I'd be in this constant cat and mouse of, he goes over to my Mimic Tear, blasts him for like 1,000 damage, and I maybe get 1 attack on if I don't miss because he's whipping around and stuff, and then he immediately comes back to me, and then I have to run away. I can't fight back, and the Mimic Tear generally either misses or does nothing at that time, and then you just repeat that process until the Mimic Tear is dead. In my tests with the Mimic Tear over and over again, I struggled to get to the point where I could actually finish off the boss with the Mimic Tear still alive. Not to mention, it was significantly harder just to stay alive and fight back. Just staying alive and getting my job done of killing the boss was so much harder with the Mimic Tear that it just paled in comparison to the Great Shield. The Great Shield soldiers are just so ridiculously good at holding the boss's aggro compared to the Mimic Tear. I can't imagine using the Mimic Tear. Even if the Mimic Tear could survive longer or do more damage, it just doesn't matter because those soldiers, those Great Shield soldiers, are so good at just keeping the boss's attention that I have free reign to do anything I want to it. If I was a sorcerer build, it'd be just as crazy. You're just sitting there casting, just free casting, and the majority of the time, he's just going to be focused on your soldiers. And it takes him forever to kill them when they're leveled up. So it's for all these reasons that I would say, in my opinion, the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes outperform the Mimic tier in most practical scenarios pretty much always. There are certain bosses, though, that you have to be careful. I tried it on a few more bosses. I tried it on the dragon on the bridge that breathes fire, the whatever, I don't know what his name is, sort of the G, and he would breathe fire. And when he breathed fire, that was a different story, because those skeletons just seemed vulnerable to magic, because AoE magic that came from above. Because the main strength of the Great Shield Soldiers is they hold a shield, and they block the damage. But if an enemy just goes above them and just breathes fire down on their heads, they can't block it, and it just destroys them. And so that is a scenario where the Mimic actually outperformed the soldiers by a lot. The soldiers were borderline useless in that scenario. But most bosses, like Margit, Margot, Godric, like any of these ones that you're going to fight, even the Elden Lord probably, it's just going to be the same thing where these soldiers are just so much better. They work out so much better in so many different boss fights. But it is one that you're going to have to play it by ear. You're going to have to see that it doesn't make sense in this boss fight or not. But in most of the boss fights, especially ones where the boss is a physical attacker with a weapon, those Great Shield Soldiers are just so busted, man. They're so strong. It's so unbelievably powerful. If you have any way to follow up with them and support them, they just tank everything and you just win the fight every single time. I also tried the Eagle guy up by Bestial Sanctum, and again, the soldiers just performed so unbelievably good compared to the Mimic that I actually had to just stop fighting him and just wait for him to kill the Great Shields, because I'd basically just won the fight while just chilling and going slow. I wasn't even trying to win it fast. I was just occasionally using one and then watching him fight them, and he still just, it was night and day. The Mimic tier, I barely even had time to get the boss down before the Mimic tier was dying, and the Great Shields, I had to just stop and let the Great Shields just die slowly because they just didn't die in time. And it's for all these reasons that I think this is the best summon. Just straight up, it's the best summon that I know of right now in the game in a practical scenario. Now, you may have some perfect way to build your Mimic that makes it comparable on certain bosses, and if so, that's cool. But for the majority of people who just want to grab a summon, throw some stuff on, and go, the Great Shield's always going to be better. It's just always going to be better. And honestly, even if you have some perfect build, in some bosses, it's still going to be better to get the Great Shield purely because of that aggro. They're just so much better at holding aggro that I just can't imagine using the Mimic tier. It just sucks compared to them. They're so much better. So hopefully that helps you out. And also, it's a summon you can get fairly early game. I think you get it the same place as the Mimic tier, actually. And yeah, it's like if you have to pick between that Mimic tier, early game, mid game, late game, you know, just use the Great Shield guys, man. Just level them up, and they will carry your brains out in these fights. It makes the fights so easy. So hopefully that helps. Now you guys know my opinion on the best summon. I feel like it's not even my opinion. It's just the science I did, the tests I did, routinely proved in real world scenarios that those Great Shields are better for the vast majority of boss fights. So in my opinion, the Great Shield Soldier's Ashes are the best summon you can possibly have in Elden Ring.